Happy Thanksgiving, everyone! This is a video I've wanted to do for years because the myths around Thanksgiving make for a nice children's story, but they're about as close to reality as the movie Shrek. And the real history is so interesting and teaches us so many lessons, even for people who aren't American, I thought I'd go through it. The version we're all taught in school is that a bunch of pilgrims with buckles on their hats came over on the Mayflower in 1620, met some nice Indians, did some farming, carved a number in a rock, and because of their hard work and perseverance had such a bountiful harvest that they had this big celebration and invited the Indians over and gave thanks to God for their great prosperity, and they all lived happily ever after. Folks, that story is 100% grade A USDA choice, pure all-American fiction. We know the real story because Governor William Bradford kept a detailed journal of what happened, beginning in 1608 when they settled in the Dutch Republic, through the Mayflower voyage and arriving in the New World in 1620, all the way through 1647, with a final tally of the Mayflower passengers and their lives through 1651. 1621 was not a bountiful harvest, nor were the Puritans tenacious and hard-working. In fact, they had proven themselves lazy and, in Bradford's terms, corrupt. Bradford writes of the small harvest and the hunger the colonists experienced afterward, and how they were desperate for ships to bring food and supplies. In fact, there's no real evidence this Thanksgiving feast ever took place. There are only two first-hand accounts of harvest festivals, which happen at the harvest every year, so they're not all that remarkable. The summer of 1621 was actually good because they had plenty of fish to catch and fowl and deer to hunt. But there's no indication they ate turkey specifically, although Bradford does mention in passing that there was a great store of wild turkeys. But turkeys didn't become associated with Thanksgiving until the 1840s. They also didn't have potatoes, pumpkins, or cranberries. And they didn't have any way of baking anything. They didn't even have buckles on their hats. Most of the food they got was actually from hunting and gathering. The harvest wasn't all it was cracked up to be. Bradford wrote, "Now the welcome time of the harvest approached, in which all had their hungry bellies filled. But it arose but too little in comparison of a full year's supply, partly by reason they were not yet well acquainted with the matter of Indian corn, and they had no other, also their many other employments, but chiefly their weakness for want of food to tend to it as they should have done. Also much was stolen both by night and day, before it became scarce eatable, and much more afterward. And though many were well whipped when they were taken for a few ears of corn, yet hunger made others, whom conscience did not restrain, to venture. So as it well appeared, the famine must still ensue the next year also, if not some way prevented, or supply should fail, to which they dared not trust. Markets there was none to go to, but only the Indians, and they had no trading commodities." So these are not the hard-working, tenacious people the myth would have us believe. They were lazy, dishonest, and starving. In fact, the only mention Bradford makes of a Thanksgiving event is in June of 1623 after a much-needed rain. It was actually the harvest later that year that turned things around. It wasn't because of weather or anything. In fact, the dry conditions continued for another few years. So what happened? Bradford wrote, "They came to the governor and besought him that, as it was before agreed that they should set corn for their particular, and accordingly they had taken extraordinary pains thereabout, that they might freely enjoy the same, and they would not have a bit of the victuals now come, but wait till harvest for their own, and let the newcomers enjoy what they had brought. They would have none of it, except they could purchase any of it of them by bargain or exchange. Their request was granted them, for it gave both sides good content, for the newcomers were as much afraid that the hungry planters would have eaten up the provisions brought, as they should have fallen into the like condition." And in the next paragraph he writes, "By this time harvest was come, and instead of famine, now God gave them plenty, and the face of things was changed, to the rejoicing of the hearts of many, for which they blessed God." So is it just me, or does it sound to you like property rights and free trade were instituted, and this is what saved them? Whereas the setup they had before, very much like socialism or communism, was causing the starvation. We don't have to guess. In fact, Bradford told us directly earlier in the year and in detail. All this while no supply was heard of, neither knew they when they might expect any. So they began to think how they might raise as much corn as they could, and obtain a better crop than they had done, that they might not still thus languish in misery. At length, after much debate of things, the governor, with the advice of the chiefest amongst them, gave way that they should set corn every man for his own particular, and in that regard trust to themselves, in all other things to go on in the general way as before. So this was the only change that was made. Everything else stayed the same. And so assigned to every family a parcel of land, according to the proportion of their number for that end, only for present use, but made no division for inheritance, and ranged all boys and youth under some family. This had very good success, for it made all hands very industrious, so as much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been by any means the governor or any other could use, and saved him a great deal of trouble, and gave far better content. The women now went willingly into the field, and took their little ones with them to set corn, which before would allege weakness and inability, whom to have compelled would have been thought great tyranny and oppression. The experience that was had in this common course and condition tried sundry years, and that amongst godly and sober men may well evince the vanity of that conceit of Plato's and other ancients, applauded by some of later times, that the taking away of property and bringing in community into a commonwealth would make them happy and flourishing, as if they were wiser than God. Yes, the concept of socialism was well known to them, although they didn't have that word for it, but as you can see, the concept was well known and in fact goes all the way back to Plato. And we saw in what was a community pretty close to everything socialism and communism say we should do, exactly what happens with socialism today. For this community, so far as it was found to breed much confusion and discontent, and retard much employment that would have been to their benefit and comfort. For the young men that were most able and fit for labor and service did repine that they should spend their time and strength to work for other men's wives and children, without any recompense. The strong, or man of parts, had no more in division of victuals and clothes than he that was weak, and not able to do a quarter the other could. This was thought injustice. The aged and graver men to be ranked and equalized in labors and victuals, clothes, etc., with the meaner and younger sort, thought it some indignity and disrespect unto them. And for men's wives to be commanded to do service for other men, as dressing their meat, washing their clothes, etc., they deemed it a kind of slavery. Neither could many husbands well brook it. Upon the point all being to have alike, and all to do alike, they thought themselves in the like condition, and one as good as another. And so, if it did not cut of those relations that God had set amongst men, yet it did at least much diminish and take of the mutual respects that should be preserved amongst them. And would have been worse if they had been men of another condition. Let none object this is men's corruption, and nothing to the course itself. I answer, seeing all men have this corruption in them, God in his wisdom saw another course fitter for them. They were shiftless and lazy while the setup was, all being to have alike and all to do alike, and doesn't that sound straight out of Marx, each according to his ability, to each according to his need? But then, those exact same people, once you make it so that they can keep what they produce on their own property and trade with each other voluntarily, capitalism in a nutshell, that was when the colony began to prosper. And this wasn't an isolated incident. Colonies all over the New World found this to be the case. Jamestown was settled in 1607, and, as was the case with Plymouth, only about half survived the first year. Most of them were shiftless, lazy parasites, and in what was called the starving time from 1609 to 1610, the population fell from 500 to just 60. People were so desperate for food that there were even charges of cannibalism. When ships came, Governor Thomas Gates announced that they were abandoning the colony, but Lord De La Warr insisted they make another go of it. So they converted to a free market and became even more prosperous than Plymouth. They each got land for themselves to use and keep the fruits of, and most of them decided to plant tobacco. By 1614, they were one of the biggest producers of tobacco around. I mean, really, how many times do we have to see this repeated over and over again? Capitalism, the free and voluntary exchange of private property and labor, begets prosperity. Socialism, the communal ownership and equal distribution of wealth, begets poverty and starvation. It's not because it wasn't real socialism, it's not because the wrong people were in power, it's not because it was the wrong society or whatever, and it's certainly not because capitalism captured it or whatever. It was capitalism that saved it. Socialism doesn't work. Deal with it. So let me just close out by giving thanks to all of you who watch my videos and hit like and subscribe and share them everywhere. And I'm especially thankful to my supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar who help keep me going through demonetization, shadow banning, and other indignities that threaten small channels like mine. If you'd like to help, you can find the links at donate.bogosity.tv, or you can make a one-time donation with PayPal or just about every major cryptocurrency. For my American friends, I hope you have a great Thanksgiving and stuff yourself full of turkey and pumpkin pie. And to all my other viewers, I hope you have a great weekend as well, and you stuff yourself full of turkey anyway, or whatever else you like. Have a great time, and as always, stay strong and be free.